Good evening. My name is Hatim Kheir. I'm counsel for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. My answers will be focused on you, Deputy Minister Keenan. So you're aware that the Windsor protest was cleared on the 13th of February, correct?
On the 13th, the Ambassador Bridge opened the 14th, so I think it cleared sort of overnight between the 13th and 14th.
Right. And are you aware that the Windsor police actually turned away tow trucks from the United States because by the 13th they were already satisfied that the company in Windsor was up to the task?
I know there were tow trucks that came across the bridge. I wasn't aware of the details of which tow trucks were used in the Windsor operation.
Okay, but you were aware that they were able to obtain tow trucks to do what they had to do?
Yes.
Okay. And with respect to Ottawa, we've heard from other witnesses that the OPP obtained tow trucks, so much so that the OPS incident commander felt that by February 13th, they were good. If I recall correctly, earlier in your testimony, you stated you weren't aware of that, right?
No, we'd been working on the tow truck strategy for 10 days and had engaged a lot of partners, and nobody had provided any information like that to us in the course of that work.
Now, you stated that around the 10th going forward, the Emergencies Act was being discussed, correct?
Options under the Emergencies Act began to be considered starting the 10th, yes.
Right. And I mean, you'd agree with me that the Emergencies Act is an extraordinary power, right?
The extraordinary power, yes.
And if alternatives are available, they should be, as a matter of policy, be used first, right?
I'm not an expert on the Act, but the working framework I have is exactly that. If you can, it's not meant to be used if you can solve the crisis using any existing authorities.
Mm-hmm. And to that effect, it would be important to be aware of what alternatives were available and workable.
Alternatives of what to what, sir?
Whatever it is sought to be done under the Act. If there's an alternative under existing law or that can be done without the use of the Act, it would be important to be up to date on that, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so given that your agency as a whole wasn't aware that the OPP had tow trucks, what steps were actually taken to get that information from the OPP, knowing that they were actually looking into the issue themselves?
So from the 4th to the 13th, sort of exhaustive steps of working with our federal partners, our federal policing partners, procurement partners, security partners, all provinces, small caucus groups of provincial officials, and working through trying to find a way to execute the 5-point plan and the tow truck strategy. So I would say, in short summary, there were probably 40 engagements by myself and my senior officials with partners trying to sort of unlock the tow truck strategy. So I would describe it as a pretty exhaustive effort, right up to and including meetings on the 13th.
So my understanding is that there was a DMOC meeting on the 13th?
Yes.
Where the Emergencies Act was discussed?
Yes.
And so going into it, your role would be to provide Transport Canada's perspective on the use of those on emergency powers?
Yes.
So prior to going into that meeting, did someone from your office just give a call to a contact at the OPP to just see how the tow truck issue was going?
There had been multiple calls and multiple exchanges with a lot of partners right up to the 13th. And I think even perhaps after that DMOC meeting, because we had a meeting with the Transport Canada ADM had convened a meeting with the RCMP partners, I think Public Service and Procurement Canada, Solicitor General, and I think transport officials in Ontario, Manitoba, and Alberta, continuing to work and find a solution to the tow truck strategy. And through all of that discussions, including in that meeting, nobody informed us of this solution that was in play. And interestingly enough, even after the decision to invoke the Act and the promulgation of the regulations, in all of the meetings we had to inform people of the new powers in terms of rendering essential services, the tow truck provision, even on the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, nobody mentioned or informed anybody at Transport Canada that there had been any solution found otherwise.
You stated that the task of obtaining tow trucks was seeming like an impossible task, but the OPP's success in obtaining them shows that that wasn't the case, right?
Well, I think you're going to have to be fair with the evidence. I don't think that's the evidence. So if you want to put to them what OPP testified to, you have to put the full picture.
So Superintendent Bernier, when he testified here, he stated that on the 13th, the way he phrased it was, quote, "As things materialized on the 13th, I was satisfied that we were good," end quote. And that was in reference to a question about tow trucks. So that seems to suggest that at least they had been able to resolve that issue, right?
I can't confirm that because, as I said, we've been working exhaustively on the tow truck strategy. All of our work, all of our conversations, and all of our analysis had led us to the opposite conclusion.
So I want to change the topic slightly. So you've referenced illegal activity in your testimony, the presence of illegal activity. Leaving aside for a moment the border protests and blocking the border, which I grant, in terms of what was happening elsewhere, are you essentially referring to things like traffic violations, bylaw violations?
In terms of illegal and unlawful activity, there's two things. The strategic enforcement strategy specifically lists a whole series of examples, and including violations of different municipal bylaws, multiple violations of the Highway Traffic Act, and multiple violations of the Criminal Code as the key examples of the unlawful activity that was apparent on a wide scale through the protests, through the blockades and the occupations.
Okay, and two of the criminal code, the two ones that were up front, I believe, were mischief and intimidation, which, from my understanding, were being committed by obstructing the roadways.
I think mischief, intimidation, obstruction, and there was one other one that was on that list, I think.
Right, but the behavior underlying, for example, a potential mischief or intimidation is through obstructing a highway, right? And the use of that highway in the case of mischief.
That was one of many. For example, the swarming of a police officer, I think, would count as obstruction.
Okay, but suffice it to say that all this behavior was already illegal and there were already authorities there to prohibit that activity?
Well, I think that was the point of the strategic enforcement strategy, is that we saw a scale and intensity of unlawful activity across Canada that police was eclipsing the ability of police to respond. And in the case of Ottawa, when they tried to respond, they were being obstructed. And so it was an attempt to communicate at a wide scale to everybody who was either participating in the illegal activity or thinking about it that it's illegal, it has consequences, and to try and convince them to rethink their approach to, a term I learned in the course of this crisis, to shrink the footprint of illegal activity, to make it more feasible for the police to have a safe operation to return law and order.
Right, and because of the existence of those legal authorities, that's why you wrote to Ms. Drouin saying that in your view, the gap was not legislative authority, but enforcement action, right?
My assessment was that there was a lack of enforcement because the scale of the unlawful activity eclipsed the ability of the police to enforce.
If I could just ask one more question. Thank you, Commissioner. So that gap in enforcement action, though, I mean, to the extent that the Windsor Police had obtained the tow trucks they needed on the 13th and were successful in clearing their protest, to the extent that the OPS incident commander on the 13th with respect to tow trucks was saying that he was satisfied that they were good, you'd agree that those are steps to then, successful steps to closing that enforcement gap?
No. Because there remained a significant, first of all, the Windsor Police needed massive assistance. There was a massive public order operation. And even as they struggled through clearing it that weekend, there was still a really significant gap in the ability of police to enforce the peace across the country. So no, the gap was not closed.
Well, I'm out of time, so those are my questions. Thank you.